Hi, friends. This is your girl KK with another episode. But today I thought we can actually do something a little different and talk about stereotypes. I've been actually taking a peace studies class this semester, and it just make me think about how we communicate with each other and what stereotypes or how stereotypes affect the way we communicate with each other. So I'm really happy to have Professor Dr. Margaret E. Lorre with us today. And she actually has a PhD in sociology and also minored in psychology. So welcome on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you today and talk about stereotypes with you and have also some professional opinion on that topic. So thank you again for coming. So why don't you just introduce yourself and also say why you're interested in that kind of field?
Well, hi everyone. I'm glad to be here. Let me talk about why I'm in this field, right? I really enjoy talking about people's interactions with other people. So I find it fascinating to look into their minds and how people interact. So stereotypes is just one of those ways that I get to observe people interacting.
So a few topics I thought we could just talk about today so people know what's up is what are stereotypes and why stereotypes might actually not be necessarily bad or good, and also how that can be used for an act of some kind of violence. And later on my co-host will actually also talk about politics right now and how stereotypes might actually affect certain complications or conflicts with nations even. But first I actually want to say that I personally went out to the Clark community and just tried to get a few opinions on what they think stereotypes are, and the question I asked them is mostly about how they were affected by stereotypes and how they themselves actually might have realized how they made stereotypes about other groups. So let's just listen to what we got as responses. So, I'm just gonna jump right into it. So, have you ever been affected by a stereotype? And if yes, how did it make you feel?
I would say it was a mixture of stereotype and also microaggression. So I think it was 2 years ago at an internship I had, and I was interacting with one of the supervisors, and then he was like, "Wow, your accent is really good for someone who's from Africa." At first I was like, "Oh, thanks, that's a compliment." But then I thought about it and I was like, wait, no.
Since I'm a dancer, I get mistaken for being gay a lot, even though I'm heterosexual. And overall, it just makes me feel a little uncomfortable because I'm not actually gay, and it's just not my identity. Yeah.
So I usually don't tend to have people say stereotypical things to me. They usually do not know what I am in terms of ethnicity, so they kind of ask me that in a condescending way. And I guess the only other time that off the top of my head I could think of when I was stereotyped was someone once said to me, "Why aren't you wearing a hijab? You would look really pretty and nice. Why aren't you wearing one?" So yeah.
Sometimes I have trouble with the angry black girl stereotype, where it's a lot of people keep a safe distance when I'm walking around, or they give me an awkward smile so they don't anger me sometimes. So that stereotype is kind of, very relevant in my experience.
Have you ever been affected by stereotypes here at Clark too?
Maybe, but not necessarily. I would assume, I feel sometimes it does happen, but not so obvious. So in groups, there was this group project I was in, and when we started it was 2 boys and me, so I was the only girl. So when we got together, they assumed that they were going to be in charge of deciding what we were going to work on, which was also a stereotype in a sense, because they assume that because they're males then they get to decide what we get to do. So.
And how do you in general deal with stereotypes?
When I was younger, I definitely manifested it. I would keep the fact that I danced to myself a lot, but as I started to get older and start to identify more with dance, I kind of took it head on, and now I just kind of laugh whenever somebody asks me, like, are you gay? I just kind of laugh and say, yes, I am, like, no, sorry, no, I am straight, but yes, I dance. It is possible for heterosexual males to dance.
Essentially, I don't let it get to me. I just, like, I kind of fight it by just, like, well, this is not how it's gonna go, because I have a voice too. We're all paying to be here, so we're all gonna work or contribute together to make the project be, like, I'll be a part of it.
A way that I think that I cope with it is that I also know that other people deal with that situation that are like me. So I am in BSU, so I can talk to other Black identifying females as people who also go through that.
Okay, what stereotypes do you have of other groups?
Okay.
Well, living in Los Angeles, we drive a lot, and there's always one part of the city that everybody hates driving in, and that's Glendale, because a lot of Armenians live there, and I guess stereotypically Armenians are bad drivers, and my experience so far has, I guess I kind of believe in that stereotype that Armenians are generally not good drivers.
One stereotype I tend to exhibit is how homosexuals tend to be flamboyant because the ones that are surrounding me kind of are. A majority of them are.
I do think that Asians are typically smart. I think that like if I see an Asian, like, oh, what's your major? Biology or like engineering or some sort? Yeah.
I think a stereotype that a lot of people think of is just like when they see someone who's Asian that does work, they think that they're really good at math. And part of my involvement of being someone who's supposed to be aware of what they're thinking and aware of their actions and trying to eliminate stereotypes like those, along with stereotypes that are also aligned with white people or people that are from East Asia. And I'm trying to do that by thinking twice. Like thinking before I speak, thinking why I think a certain thing instead of just acting on it. Or even just like rethinking about why I think a certain way.
And is there anything that you do that makes you limit these stereotypes against other groups?
I know it's just a generalization, and I guess how I can dispel that is just know whenever I'm thinking that, just know that it's not the defining aspect of that whole group of people, and just keep on going and being accepting.
I have dispelled it because I realize people are different.
I try not to let it be. I try to see more than their identity by like asking questions and getting to know them. Because stereotypes, I feel like with the people that I interact with, the stereotypes in a way that we deal with them is by just like making jokes and like minimizing the effect that it should have on us.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, that was interesting. It's so nice to hear from these beautiful Clarkies and their opinions on stereotypes.
Yeah, personally, I thought it was actually really funny when I asked them the last question about like what kind of stereotypes they have about other groups, because it really made them reflect on how they go about their relationship with like other people that they might actually like not know as well.
Exactly. And I completely agree with you on that. I couldn't help but notice also in these interviews that you conducted with these Clarkies that they typically have the popularized definition of stereotypes throughout all their answers. However, while I'm on the show today, I'd like to discuss rather a contrary belief that stereotypes are not necessarily a bad thing.
Oh, that's really interesting. Please, tell us more about that.
Oh, yeah, of course. So I have a great friend, Dr. Mikhail Lubansky. He's a psychologist. So he states that the standard definition of a stereotype, according to Webster Dictionary, is a standardized mental picture that is held in common by members of a group and that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude, or uncritical judgment. However, he furthers that, in the meantime, there is a better definition of a stereotype, one deliberately non-judgmental, stating that specific traits attributed to people based on group membership is the best definition. So rather than having a definition that explicitly states prejudice, attitude, judgment, and opinion, we go into a belief where it's just specific traits for group membership. It's a very basic surface level definition, but it's probably the most realistic one by far.
But it's really interesting because like if we think about this kind of like better definition, like actually like more accurate definition of stereotypes, we might actually also like change the relationship we have towards stereotypes and maybe then like more directly address the problems that come with like stereotypes and like the little gap between stereotypes and prejudice even, and then go from there and maybe form better relationships with one another.
Exactly. That's what I would love for people to get away with, take away from this podcast rather, is that our definition that we currently have popularized is not necessarily true. And stereotypes, you know, aren't always negative. The ones, however, that do contribute to prejudiced behaviors that we ourselves embody, that's when stereotypes can be non-beneficial and really dangerous, truly. So I think the best thing is Dr. Lubansky's a great friend, a wonderful mind, and I believe in his summary of stereotypes and prejudice, and it represents my similar perspective. For a loose paraphrase of my dear friend, he's roughly states that stereotypes pop into our minds automatically, which is true scientific fact. And if we have some awareness of stereotypical thought, we can choose to either endorse it or reject it. So by rejecting stereotypes for reasons including information we know is false, or that the reason is due to social conditions, instead of just, prejudice behaviors.
Yeah, I was just also like thinking about stereotypes and how even like I go about it. It's just like something that you sometimes like hard to go about it, since it just like pops up in your head and suddenly it's there, and maybe even like only just later when you maybe meet that person and more talk to that person that you even had that stereotype about that specific person. And it's just like something that's just like, like in the back of our head, something we automatically do, and sometimes don't even like really tend to notice most of the time.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people don't even know that this is a natural process, which can be interesting in terms of thinking about racism, prejudice, sexism, and other certain things that we might categorize under this stereotype perspective. But in truth, stereotypes aren't necessarily the problem. It's how your brain functions with it that's the problem.
So what I'm hearing is that stereotypes often have negative connotation, which is why people tend to avoid conversations about stereotypes most of the time. But can you think of an example of a contradiction to this negative perspective of stereotypes?
Oh, of course. So I was recently discussing with a close colleague about certain stereotypes that can be beneficial. An example of age requirements. I think that's what we brought about. So Professor Dale Nance, my good friend that I was having this conversation with, a rough paraphrase from him also is that most people accept that a person should be of a certain age to vote or drive a car, but neither is based universally on valid generalizations. Some 25-year-olds shouldn't be voting, and some 16-year-olds would be competent to do so. And some 12-year-olds could reasonably drive a car. But it's arguments such as these that are great because they show that stereotypes by definition can actually be beneficial, because by having certain age requirements in our society, we're able to have a functioning society, right, rather than one that's haywire. But stereotypes, on the other hand, don't get me wrong, that concern race, sex, and gender, sometimes orientation, are truly never beneficial. And in the end game, they're prejudice outcomes. So by separating the true definition of a stereotype as where we can begin to understand peaceful and factually based conversations with each other.
That's actually really interesting. And this really gives us a new perspective on how stereotypes and how like on stereotypes overall and how we should view them as well. So maybe just really quick, let's circle back for a second and talk about what you describe as the 5 theoretical components in your most recent book. Couldn't help but notice, like, before I met you, I was really excited, I have to say. So I just, like, tried to look up what you have written about that. So I would love for you to just, like, talk about what you mean by that and what these 5 components are.
Well, I love anyone who actually reads my books. So, yeah, let me tell you about the 5 theoretical components of prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination.
Please do.
So the first one is cognitive. So these are beliefs about characteristics and traits of members of a group, whether they be positive or negative, about warmth or competence. The second thing is emotional. So these are feelings towards groups, so positive or negative, like intergroup anxiety, anger, disgust, other emotions, and things like that. Then you have evaluative, which is the evaluation of the group on a continuum from positive to negative. The fourth thing is connotative. So this is behavioral intentions or tendencies that can be active or passive on the positive and negative scale. Lastly, the fifth component is behavioral. So behavior displayed towards groups. So these components can be expressed in various ways on the positive and negative scale as well, whether they're passive or aggressive.
Interesting. So just like putting all of that information together, from there we could actually kind of like make like a 3-step plan on how to like go about stereotypes.
Oh, of course.
Maybe first we should definitely recognize what we that we naturally form stereotypes, but that does not excuse prejudice behavior, which I think is a really important point. And secondly, we need to separate facts from our own opinions in order to not get our judgment clouded by stereotypes as well. And lastly, try to dismantle any other prejudiced thoughts and instead seek conversation. And just like thinking about like that, it happened actually to me a lot. Like knowing from friends, like they talk to me and suddenly they say like, oh, I thought you're like this really different person. Then we had this conversation and then I got to know them better and they got to know me better, and it was like also the other way around too. And I feel like it's just like a good kind of like steps that we just like maybe remind ourselves of like more often.
Yeah, exactly. I think from what I heard earlier about the second part of this podcast, I'm thinking of a more worldly perspective of stereotypes and the impacts that they can have, that really thinking about talking to other people and being able to communicate is the best course of action by far.
Definitely.
So, recognizing your own, I think your 3 steps is great. So recognizing your own, beliefs and recognizing that this is a prejudice really allows you to be able to get outside your comfort zone and show others compassion in a way that you may have not been able to before.
Great. Thanks so much to Madison and Caddy.
Hi, I'm Gary.
Hi, I'm Dylan.
Now we're going to be talking about how stereotypes and prejudice are present in the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yeah, we're going to be covering a little bit of the history behind the conflict, and then we're going to move into some of the stereotypes and prejudice from some interviews that we did with people on campus who have some firsthand experience.
First, to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict, we have to just get it out. The common myth is that the conflict has been going on for centuries and is about religious differences, and that isn't the case. It's more so about just 2 groups of people who both claim the same land, which started all the way back in the 1900s, not centuries ago.
Yeah, it was... The area was occupied by Muslims, Christians, and some Jews, and the Muslims in the area developed not just the identity of Arabs like many, but of Palestinians. And at the same time, the Jews in the area were joining the Zionist movement, which said that they needed their own state. And since their Holy Land was in the area, they moved to what was mandatory Palestine.
So as this was going on, as the Zionist movement was going on, obviously World War I occurred, and at the end of World War I, the British took over what became British Palestine, and they encouraged a lot more Jews to migrate there. And then at the end of World War II, with the Holocaust, there was a flood of Jews from Europe who also came to Palestine British Palestine. And then towards the end of the war, the UN proposed a two-state solution that nobody really agreed with, which kind of began the Arab-Israeli War, which marked the beginning of a decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict.
The first major engagement that was seen was in '67, the Six-Day War. Israel occupied all Palestinian territory and Egypt Sinai. They ended up giving most of that land back in the Camp David Accords, and that was the end of the wider armed Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab states made peace with no peace treaties, but Israel continues to occupy the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah, so this became less of an Arab-Israeli conflict and more of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, since Israel was occupying what Palestinians considered their land, and then that kind of spurred the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, which is kind of what we see along with Hamas as like the two major actors for Palestine. And just throughout the decades, Israel would continue to take more of Palestine's land than was agreed upon, and would move in Israelis who were settlers. And the tensions between Israel and Palestine brought up two intifadas, or two uprisings, which were incredibly violent and really perpetuated some violence. And then the first intifada ended with the Oslo Accords, which created the official Palestinian Authority, which allowed Palestine to govern themselves. But then the second intifada occurred, which was even more violent than the first, and kind of made Israelis a little more skeptical about the possibility of a solution.
And so far, we've seen more and more Israeli settlements being built as their people expand, and the Palestinians are forced further and further out of their ancestral lands. And that kind of moves us into where we are currently with the stereotypes and prejudice. And Gary did a couple of great interviews, so I'm going to let her talk about those a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dylan. And yeah, I think with this brief history, it's important to note that, of course, the prejudice and stereotypes still exist today, and the conflict is still ongoing. And so I was able to talk to a Palestinian here at Clark called Noor, and a friend of mine from Israel who's about to serve in the IDF. For both of them, I was able to a big thing that came up for both of them was how very similar stereotypes exist on both sides about the other. But we're going to hear from Erez Uzan, who's an Israeli citizen, and he's going to enter the IDF next month, and we'll talk about some other forms of prejudice that kind of exist within Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis that come from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as a really cool program that's going on in Tel Aviv schools that bring in, that unite various schools and kind of address prejudice in a unique way. So here's Erez.
My name's Erez. I'm 19 years old, Israeli, living currently in Israel, and I am soon to join the army.
I guess the whole point of this kind of podcast was kind of to explore what stereotypes look like, how they manifest in various contexts, and one obviously that we're looking at is the Israel-Palestine conflict. So we figured we'd interview an Israeli and a Palestinian who will be coming up next. But the first question I have for you, just to get right into it, would be, what kind of stereotypes do you see existing between Israel and Palestine, or Israelis and Palestinians?
I would probably say, for starters, really similar ones. Like, I reckon if you talk to more prejudiced people on both sides, they will use the same sort of adjectives to describe the other side, whether that be an affinity for violence or manipulation. Like, I think both sides tend to generalize the other group of people as very violent and as people who don't want to see a resolution to conflict, which I find funny because I think that's like the one thing that we really do have in common. The biggest thing that we have in common is the idea that we want a peaceful resolution. I see it at work, not specifically with Palestinians, but with the Israeli Arab population, which tend to identify really closely with Palestinian people.
You mentioned that you see this at work. Can you give us an example of that?
So I work at a restaurant, and basically everyone who works in the kitchen, all of our cooks, all of our chefs are Arab Israelis, and we work together. We're very friendly. There's no animosity on that end. But recently I noticed a situation where a waitress was talking to one of the cooks, and she was trying to explain something that she had written down on a note for them, and they didn't quite understand. And then they like the cook kind of absentmindedly, as he was trying to figure something out, asked her a question in Arabic, and kind of like bilingual people will tell you, if you're having a conversation and you're kind of flustered, sometimes words from another language kind of slip through. So he kind of asked her a question in Arabic, and she was like almost offended. She was like, she thought he was like saying something intentionally, so she doesn't understand, like trying to make her feel stupid. And she was like,
And the waitress, she was Israeli Jewish.
Yeah, she was Jewish Israeli. And she was like, "Don't speak Arabic to me." This workplace does operate in Hebrew, and that's a whole thing by itself. But we do start off from the assumption that this is a Hebrew-based workplace. He kind of looked at her funny, and he was like, "Well, I spent years learning Hebrew, even though it's not my first language. How about you study some Arabic?" Which is something that comes up again and again, because the Israeli school system doesn't obligate you to study Arabic, even though Hebrew and Arabic are the two official languages of Israel. Arabs do their best to study Hebrew in order to kind of assimilate into the culture, and we don't tend to do that.
Do you think that if Jewish Israelis would learn Arabic, that could kind of help, that would be really beneficial in bridging a gap between the two groups?
Oh yeah, that's for sure. Do I think that it would really bring about any solution? No, I think, just as I said in the beginning, prejudice view that we have for each other, it goes both ways. I mean, sure, when it comes to language, you can definitely say like, hey, Israeli people need to study Arabic, which is fair. But there are lots of other areas where you could say the opposite, where you could say, hey, the Arab population of Israel, or going further, the Palestinians living in the West Bank, could do a lot more to sort of accept reality living around the Jewish population. Because that's what, to me, saying Jews should study Arabic is basically saying Jewish people in Israel need to accept the reality that they are living with Arabs. The Arab population also needs to do a lot more to accept the fact that that it is living with the Jewish population of Israel, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
What other ways do you see as being effective in kind of creating empathy and bridging gaps between Arabs and Jews?
We have, like, you have the saying in English, like, everybody would get together and sing Kumbaya. In Hebrew, the saying that you say, like, the conflict's not going to be solved just by a couple of guys sitting down and eating hummus together. Like, the idea that, oh, Israelis love hummus and Palestinians love hummus. Well, the most logical thing to do is just all of us sit down, eat hummus until we're all just like satiated and have full bellies, and we're all laughing around a table. And it's become this ridiculous idea, this almost derogatory saying towards the left in Israel, which is like, you can go around eating hummus with Palestinians all you want, but it's not going to solve the conflict. It's not going to solve the problem.
What role do you see education playing in bridging gaps and breaking down stereotypes between the two groups?
I think that education is a huge, huge tool towards kind of bridging that gap, because you have programs, for example, in Tel Aviv, where the secretary, I guess, who was basically responsible for education in city of Tel Aviv for the last 10 years. He started this project where he basically connects very different schools in order to get the kids to know each other. So in Israel, you will have secular schools and religious schools, Arab schools and Jewish schools, and in Tel Aviv, it's an even bigger thing because they're also left with like a lot of different school systems in the same city. And what he thought to himself was like, hey, this is a great opportunity. And he started this mandatory program where every 2 schools are paired up, and for 1 lesson a week, the 2 classes study together. And what I find really to be the selling point, the most important thing about this was that when you get these kids together, don't waste their time by talking about how they're different. You just give them a math problem. You just do a biology experiment. You make them spend time together doing the most ordinary things in order to help them develop that understanding that they are the same.
Well, thank you. This is very insightful.
And first, we're gonna play some clips from an interview that I had with Noor, again, an international student at Clark from Palestine. We talked a lot about about stereotypes between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as Seeds of Peace, which is a program that attempts to bring people from opposing sides of conflict zones together. But I'll let her explain it further.
So my name is Noor. I go to Clark University. I major in political science and economics at the moment, and I am from Palestine.
One of my first questions for you is, what kind of stereotypes do you think exist between Israelis and Palestinians?
This is the issue, I think, in my opinion, is that Palestinians and Israelis do not meet until at a checkpoint, or like Palestinians don't see Israelis outside their uniform. So there's limited interaction in that for it to be like huge stereotypes. But the expectations of Palestinians meeting Israelis, they don't necessarily have a stereotype about a person, but they think of the violence that they've experienced before, or the violence that they're experiencing right now. Like every Palestinian knows someone or has a relative who's imprisoned at the Israelis, and so there's no motivation to cooperate from the very beginning, if that makes sense.
Have you been able to interact with Israelis at Clark, and if so, how has that changed your perception?
I was able to interact with Israelis at Seeds of Peace, a camp in Maine. I was there in 2014. Basically, you have a dialogue for 2 hours a day, and then the rest of the day you live with them and blah blah, and it sort of creates this bubble. Their intention was to create more of a peaceful environment, so that when they go back home, they see Israelis from the other side, from their own like human side, not necessarily like a checkpoint side, like I told you earlier. Here, honestly, I think there's very, very, very limited representation of Palestine, and I'll be very honest with that. I think there's a huge funding allocated for clubs on campus that are in the name of Judaism, but they are pro-Israel. And so I think there's a problem linking the religion, being Jewish, to a nationality, being pro-Israel. And so I don't agree with the fact that there's like an ethnicity, like being Jewish is considered an ethnicity, because that is a mechanism to promote being pro-Israel. On campus specifically, like there are like the Jewish groups, and nothing against their religion, that's for sure, but they do promote like birthright, the trip to Israel, and that's very political and like showing how beautiful Israel is, or how the opportunities they can seek in there, and they don't necessarily show the other side of the conflict of like how are Palestinians living, or like the not so beautiful side, the ugly side of the conflict.
Going back to the camp that you were talking about in Maine, can you talk a little more about how they tried to foster peace? Like, what kind of activities did you do? What kind of questions did they ask you?
So you live in a bunk, and in that bunk you have Israelis and Palestinians and also Americans. So this camp is made for people from conflict zones. So there were people from India, Pakistan, and Kashmir, and there were people from Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and America, and they were Americans too. And so they all live in a bunk. And then during the day you have activities, like simple activities like maybe swimming, running, like stuff like that. And then they also had religious services every Friday for Muslims, and Saturday for Jewish, and Sunday for Christians. During the day you have a 2-hour dialogue. You go to a certain area with your group, and you talk about the conflict. You talk about what you think about it, and then before you start the dialogue, they have a day or two for the Palestinians and Israelis and people in the group to know each other more. And we have facilitators, an Israeli facilitator and a Palestinian facilitator in these groups. And so it lasts for 2 hours, and then after that you go back to normal life of like eating, doing activities.
What were the conversations like in those dialogues? Like, do you think they were able to foster a good understanding between two groups?
For the most part, yes. Like, my group wasn't as bad as other groups. Other groups I've heard, like, it was kind of insulting, and I mean the facilitators try to keep it down, but there's definitely tension. I think like, as a Palestinian, I think I'm very lucky that I was able to interact with Israelis. It was helpful, but I don't think there was like a tangible outcome. If that makes sense.
Did you find yourself being friends with Israelis in the camp?
I don't know. I was friendly, but I wasn't friends. And I think because of the mentality of I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to show. I'm here to basically convey my story, and basically let the other side know that, like, we are here and this is how we think and this is how we feel.
So it was very much like you need to listen to me, rather than I have to listen to you. And really should be going both ways. Right?
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Also, my experience with the camp, like, I wasn't comfortable at all. Not because of the political issues, but because of like social issues. Like, when I went in 2014, I was very conservative in who touches me. Like, I hated when a man touched me. And that was an issue for me, and I felt so uncomfortable, and so I think that also reflected on my entire experience.
It was a culture shock.
Yeah, exactly. I experienced the culture shock before I experienced the political shock. So so I think it kind of also affected
your willingness to
attribute to the
So what do you see as a solution to the conflict, and can it be peaceful?
I don't believe in the two-state solution. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the idealist at this point is for it to be one state and then all live peacefully. From the Palestinian standpoint, I would say the Palestinian state, but from a realistic standpoint, it would be the Israeli state.
That's interesting, because like you'd have to live together. That sounds like it would be very toxic, especially at the beginning. And how would we break that down?
I think even with that, there would be like neighborhoods dedicated for Palestinians and Israelis. I don't think there would be like a lot of mingling between both, unless it is like in more economic structure, like downtown and stuff like that. But like living situations, I feel like it would be segregated in a way.
Besides Seeds of Peace, do you see anything else that can help break down stereotypes and foster peace between Israelis and Palestinians?
There's also Generation Speaks idea that was originated from Brandeis University, actually from an Israeli, and it's basically Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians working together to create a venture, or be part of Mass Challenge, like start their own businesses in a way, cooperate. So my point is basically that there are organizations that are willing to bring peace.
And I guess my last question for you is, do you see these programs as being effective solutions?
Unfortunately, sometimes there isn't an outcome, like you don't really see the difference, but also other times part of why is because these programs are funded by big pro-Israel donors whose big donors are willing to show Israel or like Israelis as people willing to cooperate, but there's also behind the scenes of you have to go into the military after you're done with high school, and then go into the military, you're gonna be part of the conflict, and you're gonna see, and it can probably also strengthen your feelings of hatred against Palestinians.
So like even if you were in high school into this like joint group thing, you'd be going into the IDF and then just getting re-indoctrinated all over again.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Little effect of these big organizations, because I think reality does dominate what is happening. So like the people who were, some of the Israelis who were in Seeds of Peace were, it was their senior year of high school or junior year of high school, and they were going to go to the Israeli military afterwards. So I think a 3-week program is not gonna affect them as for years of being in the military.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Noor.
Yes,
this is
definitely,
so helpful.
definitely.
I learned so much.
Cool, so that was from Noor, and I think what was really interesting about this was it's definitely a program that means well, but doesn't really achieve what it wants in the long run. And from the research that I've done, programs like this only really work if you keep it within the conflict zone, rather than taking people outside and bringing them to Maine, for example.
Now, I did a interview with one of the students from J Street U. I don't have any recorded audio. However, I'm just going to do a quick summary from the transcript that I have of our conversation over messages, and hopefully you can learn a little bit about their mission of trying to expose some of the problems with the birthright trip and it being used as a tool sometimes so that people from America and other countries, when they take their trip back to Israel for birthright, don't see the problems that are going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So I had a conversation with Julian from J Street U, which here at Clark is J Street U, Clark University. It is our local chapter of the campus organizing arm of J Street, the pro-Israel, pro-peace advocacy group that works towards a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. Now, they have done a number of events over the past couple of years. They have done events on settlements, the ongoing Jewish settlements, Israelite settlements in the West Bank of Palestine, and the military occupation there. They have sometimes had monthly discussions about trips to Israel and the trips to Israel, the birthright trips, and some of the propaganda that goes on there, keeping Americans from seeing some of the problems that have been caused by encroachment with settlements. And they've also organized panels on the two-state solution and how that could possibly be achieved. Of course, they have done that with the Peace Studies Department, so a nice connection to our class. In a larger view, at Stanford University, actually, Jewish students had held an event, and it was protested by a die-in by Students for Justice in Palestine. And so the Halal Club there began working with J Street U to run better events, take a more active role in planning, so that they could have conversations about Jewish and Palestinian experiences and talk about the two of them as a people in sharing a space together. It was a really interesting conversation. I think everyone should check out their work because just like Julian asked, because they're a great organization and they deserve a nice look over. That was the summary of my interview with Julian from J Street U, Clark University. Now, we talked about a lot of broad concepts today, and we talked about a lot of various people and a lot of various interviews that we did. So we're hoping that this will get you to ask questions about how stereotypes impact your life and how stereotypes impact the world and the way that we interact with one another, and how these stereotypes, as we break them down, can help to solve some of our larger conflicts. We hope that you had a great time listening. Have a good rest of your day.